The airport buzzed with the usual hum of activity: hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and the occasional overhead announcement. Among the crowd stood a poised black woman, her tailored blazer and confident demeanor setting her apart. She glanced at her first-class ticket and made her way to the boarding gate, ready to settle into her seat and prepare for the day ahead. But as she approached, a subtle tension began to build. The gate agent, a young man in his mid-30s, gave her a look too many black women know all too well. It wasn't just a glance to confirm her boarding group or check her ID. It was a look drenched in disbelief, a silent question hanging in the air. Her heart sank for a moment, but she quickly reminded herself of who she was and what she stood for. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass?" he asked, his tone professional but tinged with skepticism. She handed it over with a polite smile, watching as his eyes scanned the ticket. "First class, huh?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. The comment was subtle, but it carried weight. She could feel the judgment in his voice, the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong in the exclusive section of the plane. "Yes, first class," she replied evenly, her voice steady and calm. But instead of handing the ticket back, he hesitated. A small frown creased his face as he glanced between her and the boarding pass. "I'm going to need some additional verification," he said, his words slicing through the air like a cold wind. The passengers behind her shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered, while others blatantly stared. She could feel their eyes on her, a mix of curiosity, pity, and perhaps even agreement with the agent's insinuation. For a moment, she considered letting the frustration boil over, but she knew better. She had been here before, accused, underestimated, doubted, and every time she had risen above it. Taking a deep breath, she stepped aside as the agent motioned for a supervisor. The minutes stretched on, each one amplifying the humiliation and indignity of the moment. She heard snippets of conversation from the line behind her. "What's taking so long? Why does she need extra verification?" When the supervisor finally arrived, the woman had regained her composure, her expression calm but unyielding. The supervisor glanced at the ticket and then back at her. "Is there a problem here?" The gate agent launched into an explanation, his words laced with assumptions that didn't need to be said aloud. "It's just that she doesn't look like... we just wanted to be sure." And there it was. The insinuation spoken, if not directly, but in a way that couldn't be mistaken. The woman locked eyes with the supervisor, her gaze steady and unshakable. "No problem at all," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "I'd just like to board my flight now. Unless, of course, you prefer that I miss it." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between protocol and an emerging realization that this was no ordinary passenger. Still, the delay persisted, and as the woman waited, the whispers around her grew louder. Who was this woman? Why was she being questioned so intensely? And why did she seem so composed, almost as if she was used to moments like these? She smiled inwardly, knowing that the answer to all those questions would come soon enough. But for now, she was content to let them wonder. After all, she had nothing to prove, at least not to them. As the gate agent reluctantly handed her back the ticket, she leaned in slightly, her voice low but firm. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "I'll be sure to let the airline know how well you're handling first-class passengers today." With that, she walked down the jet bridge, leaving the stunned gate staff behind. But this wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. Because when she took her seat in first class, the murmurs followed her. And that's when she decided it was time to reveal who she really was. Stay tuned for the moment that left everyone speechless, a moment that shattered assumptions and sent a powerful message about judgment, privilege, and the power of perseverance. You won't want to miss it. As she settled into her seat, the weight of the stairs didn't lift. Even with the cabin doors closing and the announcement reminding everyone to turn off their devices, the atmosphere buzzed with unspoken questions. The woman adjusted her scarf, reached for her tablet, and made herself comfortable, as though oblivious to the tension lingering in the air. But she wasn't oblivious, not at all. Years of experience had taught her to recognize these moments, to navigate them with grace and purpose. The flight attendant approached, offering her a warm towel and a drink menu. The smile on the attendant's face seemed genuine, but there was a flicker of hesitation, just a second too long before placing the towel in her hand. The woman thanked her politely, her voice steady as always, and returned her attention to the tablet in front of her. What the rest of the passengers couldn't know was that this wasn't her first encounter with such quiet prejudice. It wouldn't be her last. For years, she had faced questions about her competence, her authority, even her very presence in spaces she had every right to occupy. She had built a career on breaking barriers, shattering ceilings, and proving wrong the countless people who had underestimated her. As the plane began to taxi, she thought back to her childhood. Raised in a modest neighborhood, she had been taught early on that the world wouldn't always see her for who she was. Her parents had drilled into her the importance of education, resilience, and self-respect. They'd always said, "You may have to work twice as hard to get half as far, but never let that stop you." Her journey to the seat she occupied now, a literal and figurative seat, had been anything but easy. After excelling in school, she earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university, where she majored in political science and graduated at the top of her class. But even with accolades, internships, and glowing recommendations, she was constantly met with disbelief when she walked into interviews or courtrooms. People didn't expect someone like her, a young black woman, to command authority with such ease. Law school had been another battleground, where she faced professors who questioned her aptitude and classmates who avoided studying with her. She learned to let the microaggressions roll off her shoulders, to channel her frustration into brilliance. When she passed the bar exam on her first attempt, her detractors were silent. And when she began arguing cases in court, her eloquence left little room for doubt. But none of that had prepared her for the day she was sworn in as a judge. That moment had been surreal, standing in front of her family, her mentors, and the very community that had supported her. She remembered looking out into the crowd, seeing her mother's tear-streaked face, her father's proud smile, and the glimmers of hope in the eyes of young girls who saw in her a future they hadn't dared to imagine. Still, even with her black robe and the title of Your Honor, she couldn't escape the deeply ingrained biases that followed her every move. There were attorneys who refused to address her with respect, court officials who assumed she wasn't the judge, and even litigants who looked past her, searching for someone in charge. Every day was a reminder that for some people, her accomplishments would never be enough. The plane leveled out, and the seatbelt sign turned off. She took a sip of water, watching the clouds drift past her window. The man seated across the aisle glanced at her ticket stub, still peeking out from her tablet case. He didn't say anything, but his expression spoke volumes. She caught his gaze and smiled, a small, polite smile that held no apology. He quickly looked away. In her line of work, she'd learned that people's assumptions often said more about them than they did about her. But what made this moment different, what made it sting just a little more, was how public it had been. The gate agent's doubt, the whispers from the crowd, the supervisor's half-hearted intervention. It wasn't just a private insult. It was a spectacle, one that invited everyone around her to join in questioning her worth. The flight attendant returned, her voice cheerful but a touch too loud. "Would you like anything else to drink, ma'am?" The woman politely declined, but the interaction only reinforced her sense of isolation. She noticed the way the attendant lingered slightly longer than necessary, perhaps trying to reconcile her presence in first class with whatever assumptions had been made. Behind her, she heard snippets of conversation. "Do you think she's famous?" One passenger murmured. "Maybe she's an athlete," another replied. She fought the urge to turn around and correct them, to explain that she wasn't a celebrity, that her success didn't come from throwing a ball or starring in a movie. Not that there was anything wrong with those achievements, but why was it so hard for people to imagine that she might have earned her place here through intellect and hard work? As the meal service began, she opened a folder she had tucked into her bag. Inside were documents she needed to review for an upcoming case, a high-profile matter that would undoubtedly draw media attention. She scanned the pages, making notes in the margins with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years honing her craft. Her focus was sharp, unshaken by the noise around her. But as she worked, a part of her couldn't help but think about the gate agent, the passengers, and the whispers. She thought about the countless other women, especially women of color, who faced similar moments of doubt and dismissal. Not all of them had the platform she did, the ability to push back against those biases and make people think twice. Her thoughts were interrupted by the flight attendant once again, this time asking if she'd like to order dessert. The woman declined with a gracious smile, but she could feel the weight of the attendant's curiosity. It was only a matter of time before someone asked the question outright. She decided to let them wait. There was a quiet power in withholding her identity, in letting the mystery linger. She wanted them to feel the discomfort of their own assumptions, to sit with the unease of not knowing who she was or why she was there. The man across the aisle cleared his throat, clearly building up the courage to speak. Finally, he leaned over, his voice low. "Excuse me, ma'am, but are you someone important?" She looked up from her documents, meeting his eyes with a calm, measured gaze. "I suppose that depends on your definition of important," she said, her tone neutral but layered with meaning. The man flushed, stammering an apology. She returned to her work, but inside, she was smiling. She knew the revelation would come soon enough, and when it did, it would be worth every second of suspense. The flight moved along smoothly, the gentle hum of the engines blending with the low murmur of conversation. She remained focused on her documents, marking critical points and mentally preparing her arguments for the upcoming case. But no matter how much she tried to immerse herself in her work, she couldn't completely shake the feeling of being watched. The occasional sideways glance from the man across the aisle, the whispered exchanges from rows behind her, it all created an undercurrent of tension. She thought about the gate agent again, his dismissive tone and thinly veiled doubt. It wasn't the first time she had encountered someone like him, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But something about the interaction nagged at her. Was it his assumption that she didn't belong, or was it the fact that no one else had stepped in to challenge it? Her thoughts drifted to her mother, who had always been her fiercest advocate. She could hear her voice as clear as day. Asterisk, don't let them make you feel small. You've worked too hard to shrink yourself for anyone. Asterisk, her mother's words were a lifeline, reminding her of the strength she carried, the generations of resilience that had been passed down to her. The flight attendant reappeared, offering coffee to the passengers. The woman accepted, using the moment to observe the cabin. She noticed a young couple 2 rows ahead, both engrossed in a movie. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man tapped furiously on his laptop, muttering something under his breath, and a few seats back, a group of business people laughed quietly, their conversation punctuated by the occasional clink of glasses. She wondered what stories they carried, what assumptions they had made about her. She wondered if any of them had noticed the unease in the gate agent's voice or the awkward pause when the supervisor was called, and if they had noticed, had they cared. The man across the aisle leaned forward again, his curiosity clearly getting the better of him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cautious but insistent. "I couldn't help but notice. You seem familiar. Are you, by chance, on TV or something?" She smiled politely, setting her coffee down. "No, I'm not on TV," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "Oh," he said, leaning back slightly. "I just thought, the way you carry yourself, you must do something important." She met his gaze, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. "I believe everyone does something important," she said. The man seemed taken aback, unsure how to respond. He nodded awkwardly and returned to his laptop, though his glances didn't stop entirely. She returned to her work, but the interaction left her thinking about the ways people projected their assumptions onto others. As the flight continued, the cabin grew quieter, with many passengers settling into naps or their in-flight entertainment. She turned her attention back to her notes, feeling the familiar rhythm of her work steadying her. Each document she reviewed brought her closer to the crux of the case, a matter involving systemic discrimination in a hiring process. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, preparing to preside over a case that would challenge deeply ingrained biases, all while navigating them herself at 30,000 feet. The case was complicated, involving a whistleblower who claimed to have evidence of discriminatory practices at a major corporation. The company, of course, denied the allegations, presenting its hiring policies as fair and inclusive, but the evidence suggested otherwise. As she reviewed the details, she couldn't help but feel a personal connection to the case. She thought about the countless obstacles she had faced on her path to becoming a judge. The doubters, the gatekeepers, the unspoken barriers that had been placed in her way. She thought about the young women who had written her letters, thanking her for being a visible example of what was possible. This case wasn't just about the law, it was about sending a message, about setting a precedent that could ripple far beyond the courtroom. As she worked, she didn't notice a flight attendant approaching again, this time with a tray of snacks. "Ma'am, I just wanted to check if there's anything else you might need," the attendant said, her tone unusually warm. The woman looked up, surprised by the shift in attitude. "No, thank you. I'm fine," she replied, offering a polite smile. The attendant lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more. "I just wanted to say, I hope you're having a pleasant flight," she added before walking away. It was subtle, but the change in demeanor was noticeable. Had the attendant figured out who she was? Or was it simply the effect of seeing her engrossed in work, her confidence shining through despite the earlier tension? Either way, it reminded her of the power of perception and the way people's attitudes could shift once they realized they might have underestimated someone. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting her out of her thoughts. She braced herself against the armrest, glancing around to see how the other passengers were reacting. The young couple ahead clutched each other's hands, while the man across the aisle gripped his laptop tightly. The turbulence passed quickly, but it left behind a renewed sense of vulnerability, a reminder that even at this altitude, they were all subject to forces beyond their control. She returned to her notes, but her focus was interrupted once again, this time by a passenger walking down the aisle. It was a woman in her 50s, dressed in a smart suit, with an air of authority that matched her own. The woman paused beside her seat, looking down with a curious expression. "I couldn't help but notice," the woman said, her voice low but firm. "Are you in law by any chance?" She looked up, meeting the stranger's gaze. "Yes, I am," she said simply. The woman nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly as if piecing something together. "I thought so. I'm an attorney myself. Your face seems familiar. Have we met at a conference or a panel, perhaps?" "It's possible," she replied, her tone non-committal. The attorney smiled knowingly. "Well, I just wanted to say, it's always good to see another woman in law, especially in first class. It's not as common as it should be." "Thank you," she said, a genuine warmth in her voice. The attorney nodded again and returned to her seat, leaving the woman with a small sense of validation. It was a reminder that, even in the midst of doubt and judgment, there were always allies, people who recognized her worth without needing an explanation. As the flight neared its destination, she began to pack up her documents, preparing for the busy day ahead. The tension in the cabin had eased somewhat, but she knew the questions about her identity weren't fully resolved, and she was okay with that. Because soon enough they would know, and when they did, the assumptions, the whispers, and the doubt would fall away, leaving only the truth of who she was and the journey that had brought her here. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimmed, and a soft announcement from the captain reminded everyone to prepare for landing. She fastened her seatbelt and glanced out the window, watching the city lights below grow brighter as they approached the airport. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the quiet murmurs among passengers carried a sense of lingering curiosity. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat, stealing one last glance her way. He looked like he wanted to say something but seemed to think better of it, settling instead for adjusting his laptop bag. Behind her, the business group's conversation had died down to low whispers, but she could still feel the occasional gaze landing on her back. It was as though her presence in first class had become the unspoken mystery of the flight, a puzzle no one had yet solved. The young couple ahead of her gathered their belongings, the woman leaning over to whisper something to her partner. He nodded, then turned his head slightly in her direction before quickly looking away. She could guess the conversation without hearing it. Asterisk though, you think she's someone important. I wonder what she does. Asterisk, it was always the same script, one she had seen play out in countless other situations. As the flight attendant walked through the cabin, checking seat belts and tray tables, she paused beside her seat once more. This time, her smile was softer, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, I hope you've had a pleasant flight," she said, her voice quieter than before. "Thank you," the woman replied, her tone polite but measured. The attendant hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the seat back. "If you don't mind me saying, it's not often we see someone so composed and distinguished. I hope you'll fly with us again." She held the attendant's gaze for a moment, sensing the shift in tone, less condescending, more genuine. It was as if the attendant was trying to make amends for whatever assumptions had lingered earlier. "I appreciate that," she said with a small smile. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, she felt a quiet anticipation building. She knew what was coming, knew it as surely as she knew the sun would rise the next day. The gate agent would likely still be there, overseeing the disembarkation process. And when she stepped off the plane, she would see the same eyes that had doubted her just hours ago. This time, however, the situation would be different. The passengers around her began to gather their belongings, filling the aisle with the usual shuffle of bags and jackets. She stayed seated, calm and unhurried, watching as people moved around her. The young couple passed her seat, the woman glancing her way with a fleeting look of curiosity. The man across the aisle gave her a tight smile as he stood, but it was clear he still had questions he wouldn't dare voice. Finally, it was her turn to stand. She adjusted her scarf, slid her tablet into her bag, and retrieved her coat from the overhead bin. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt the weight of eyes on her once more. The flight attendant offered her a final, almost reverent nod as she approached the front of the plane. The gate agent was there, just as she had expected, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. He watched as the first-class passengers filed off, his gaze flickering with recognition when he saw her. For a brief moment, his composure faltered, a flicker of something, embarrassment, unease, crossing his face. She met his eyes without hesitation, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't need to say anything. The truth of who she was would reveal itself soon enough. As she walked through the jet bridge and into the terminal, the buzz of the airport surrounded her. People rushed to their gates, announcements echoed overhead, and the faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air. She kept her pace steady, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. At the end of the terminal, a man in a suit waited, holding a small placard with her name on it. His demeanor was professional, his stance confident. When he saw her approaching, he straightened and offered a respectful nod. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Welcome. I'm here to escort you to the courthouse." She returned his nod, handing him her briefcase. The title hung in the air, unmistakable and undeniable. For anyone within earshot, it would be clear now. She wasn't just a passenger, or a lawyer, or someone important. She was a Supreme Court judge, a trailblazer who had earned her place at the highest level of justice. She could feel the stares again, but this time they felt different, less doubtful, more curious, even admiring. The whispers began almost immediately, rippling through the nearby crowd like a wave. "That's her, a judge. I can't believe it. She looks so young. Did you hear what he called her? Your Honor." As the escort led her toward the exit, she allowed herself a small smile. The weight of their assumptions, their judgments, had been lifted. The truth had a way of doing that, cutting through the noise, silencing the doubts. But she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. She stepped into the waiting car, her mind already shifting to the work ahead. The case, the arguments, the decisions, it was all waiting for her. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The journey wasn't over, but she had once again reminded the world who she was and what she stood for. As the car pulled away from the terminal, she glanced back at the airport. The gate agent was still standing there, his figure small against the bustling backdrop. She didn't know what he was thinking, but she hoped he had learned something that day. Sometimes, the people we least expect are the ones who shatter every stereotype, who rise above every obstacle, and who leave us questioning our own biases. She turned back to face the road ahead, her resolve unshaken. The next chapter of her journey awaited, and she was ready to meet it head-on. As the car glided through the city streets, she settled into the leather seat, letting the hum of the engine provide a momentary reprieve from the events of the day. The courthouse was still a good 20 minutes away, and she used the time to mentally prepare for the proceedings. She was confident in her ability to preside over the case, but the events on the flight lingered in her mind, tugging at the corners of her focus. She thought again about the gate agent, his dismissive glance, and the subtle yet undeniable challenge to her identity. It wasn't just the actor being questioned, it was the cumulative weight of moments like those, a lifetime of proving herself in spaces that weren't designed to accommodate her. And yet she carried on, not because she had to, but because she knew it mattered. She had long accepted that her presence alone was a challenge to the status quo. The driver's voice cut through her thoughts. "Your Honor, I just received a message from the courthouse. It seems there's been an unexpected development." She straightened in her seat, her instincts immediately on alert. "What kind of development?" The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression carefully neutral. The opposing counsel filed a motion early this morning, a last-minute attempt to introduce new evidence. The hearing may be delayed. She felt a flicker of irritation but kept her composure. "And the nature of this evidence?" "I'm not sure, Your Honor. I was told it's related to the whistleblower's testimony, but no further details were provided." She nodded, her mind already racing through the possibilities. A delay was inconvenient, but not entirely unusual in high-profile cases like this. Still, the timing felt deliberate, almost calculated, a move designed to throw her off balance. She had dealt with tactics like this before, and she knew better than to let them unsettle her. As they approached the courthouse, the familiar sight of reporters and photographers greeted her. A cluster of them had already gathered at the steps, their cameras poised and ready. The case had drawn significant media attention, and she was no stranger to being under the spotlight. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself that her focus was on the law and the people it served, not the spectacle that surrounded it. The car came to a smooth stop, and the driver quickly exited to open her door. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement, and was immediately met with a flurry of camera flashes. Questions were shouted in her direction, each one more chaotic than the last. "Your Honor, do you think the new evidence will change the outcome of the case?" "Judge, do you believe the corporation acted in bad faith?" "Any comment on the whistleblower's credibility?" She ignored the barrage, walking with purpose toward the courthouse entrance. The security detail parted the crowd, allowing her a clear path through the chaos. As she entered the building, the noise faded behind her, replaced by the solemn quiet of the courthouse lobby. Inside, she was met by a clerk who handed her a sealed folder. "This was just delivered for you, Your Honor," the clerk said, her voice laced with curiosity. She took the folder, noting the lack of markings on the envelope. It was unusual for her to receive documents in this manner, especially so close to a hearing. She carried it to her chambers, closing the door behind her before carefully opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in an unassuming font. As she read the words, her pulse quickened. The note claimed to contain information that could discredit the whistleblower's testimony entirely, casting doubt on their motivations and credibility. But something about it felt off. The language was vague, the accusations thinly veiled. It wasn't evidence, it was an attempt to sway her perception before the hearing, and whoever had sent it clearly wanted to remain anonymous. Her mind reeled with questions. Who had sent the note? And why had they chosen this method? Was it an act of desperation from the corporation trying to protect its interests, or was it someone within the whistleblower's own circle attempting to manipulate the narrative? She picked up the phone and dialed the clerk. "I need you to trace the source of the document that was just delivered to my chambers. Find out who sent it and how it arrived." "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk replied promptly. As she hung up, she couldn't shake the uneasy feelings settling over her. The case was already complex, but this development added a new layer of intrigue and potential danger. She had no intention of letting unverified claims to derail the proceedings, but she knew she had to tread carefully. The knock on her chamber door broke her train of thought. It was her law clerk, a young woman with a sharp mind and an unwavering dedication to justice. "Your Honor, the attorneys are ready for the pre-hearing conference," she said. "Thank you," the judge replied, standing and smoothing her robes. She followed the clerk to the conference room, her thoughts still lingering on the anonymous note. As she entered the room, the opposing counsel looked up, their expressions betraying nothing. But she caught a fleeting glance between two of them, a momentary exchange that only deepened her suspicion. Whatever they were planning, she was determined to uncover it. The stakes had just been raised, and the tension in the room was palpable. As she took her seat, she prepared herself for what was to come, knowing that the twists and turns of this case were far from over. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation as she entered and took her place at the bench. The gallery was packed, every seat filled with reporters, legal professionals, and curious onlookers who had followed the case from the start. The attorneys stood at their tables, their faces a mix of determination and wariness. This was it, the moment the entire case had been building toward. She opened the proceedings with her usual calm authority, her voice steady and resolute. "This court is now in session." As the formalities concluded, she turned her attention to the opposing counsel, who looked particularly smug today, their confidence suggesting they believed their last-minute motion had tipped the scales in their favor. "Counsel, you may present your motion," she said, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The lead attorney stepped forward, clutching a folder that seemed to contain the evidence they had so urgently submitted. "Your Honor, we believe this new material will cast significant doubt on the credibility of the whistleblower's testimony. It is imperative that the court considers this before proceeding further." She motioned for the clerk to bring her the documents. As she reviewed them, her expression remained neutral, but her mind raced. The evidence consisted of poorly sourced allegations and vague claims, none of which was substantiated by reliable documentation. It was clear to her that this was a calculated attempt to delay the trial and muddy the waters. After a few moments, she looked up and addressed the attorney. "Counsel, while the court appreciates the urgency with which you have brought this forward, I must remind you that evidence must meet a certain threshold of credibility to be admissible. These documents fail to meet that standard." The attorney opened their mouth to protest, but she held up a hand to silence them. "However, I am deeply concerned about the origins of this evidence and its potential misuse to obstruct justice. Therefore, I am ordering an immediate inquiry into its source. Until then, this material will not be admitted into evidence." The attorney's confidence visibly faltered, and murmurs rippled through the gallery. She could see the gears turning in everyone's minds. Who had provided this supposed evidence, and what was their true motive? The whistleblower was called to the stand next, and as they testified, the courtroom hung on every word. Their account was detailed and consistent, painting a damning picture of the corporation's unethical practices. She observed the jury closely, noting their reactions. They appeared engaged, their expressions shifting between shock and disbelief as the testimony unfolded. It was then, during a brief recess, that her clerk returned with new information. The anonymous note from earlier had been traced, not to the opposing counsel, but to someone within the whistleblower's own organization. Her heart sank as she realized the implications. When the court reconvened, she carefully addressed the room. Before we proceed further, this court has uncovered a troubling development. It appears that the source of the contested evidence and the anonymous communication to this court originates from within the whistleblower's organization. This raises serious questions about potential internal sabotage. The gallery erupted into whispers, the revelation sending shockwaves through the room. The whistleblower looked stunned, their face a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. She banged her gavel to restore order. Let me be clear. This court will not tolerate any attempts to manipulate the judicial process. An independent investigation will be launched immediately. In the meantime, we will proceed with the evidence and testimony already on record. The trial continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The whistleblower, though shaken, delivered a powerful closing statement that resonated with both the jury and the audience. As the deliberations began, she reflected on the twists and turns of the case. It had been a test, not only of the legal system, but of her own resilience and ability to navigate the unexpected. Hours later, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty. The corporation was held accountable for its actions, and the whistleblower's courage was validated. Yet, as the courtroom erupted in relief and applause, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. As she left the courthouse, her clerk approached her with an envelope. "Your Honor, this just arrived for you. No sender, no markings. Again." She opened it cautiously, her eyes scanning the typed words. This time, the message was chillingly direct. Justice may have been served today, but the real game has just begun. She folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, her expression unreadable. The fight for justice was far from over, and she knew she would face even greater challenges ahead. But as she walked down the courthouse steps, the weight of her robe a reminder of the responsibility she carried, she was ready. For every twist, every conflict, and every shadow that tried to obscure the truth, she knew she would stand firm. Because justice wasn't just a destination, it was a journey. And hers was only just beginning. The courthouse was quiet now, the bustling energy of the trial replaced by a solemn stillness. The echoes of the gavel's final strike lingered in her mind as she sat in her chambers, the faint glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The verdict had been delivered, justice had been served, and yet the mysterious note in her pocket weighed heavily on her thoughts. The words replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. The real game has just begun. It wasn't the first time she had encountered threats or cryptic messages in her career, but this one felt different. It wasn't just aimed at her. It was a challenge to the very ideals she had spent her life upholding. She knew better than to let fear take root, but she also understood the importance of vigilance. As she prepared to leave, her clerk knocked softly on the door. "Your Honor, I know it's been a long day, but the press is still waiting outside. They're hoping for a statement." She nodded, standing and straightening her robe. "Thank you, but I think I'll let the verdict speak for itself. It's been a long fight, and the focus should remain on the courage of those who brought this case forward." Her clerk smiled. "You've handled this with incredible grace. It's inspiring." She gave a small nod of appreciation, the words resonating with her more than she let on. Stepping out into the hallway, she moved past the reporters and cameras, declining interviews with a polite but firm gesture. The flashes of light and the hum of questions were part of the job, but tonight she needed a moment to reflect away from the chaos. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring past her window as she replayed the events of the trial. The whistleblower's bravery had been extraordinary, their willingness to expose wrongdoing a reminder of the power of individual action. But the betrayal within their own organization was a sobering reality, a reminder that even among allies, trust could be fragile. At home, she settled into her favorite chair, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside her. The note sat on the coffee table, its presence undeniable. She stared at it for a long moment before pulling out her phone to call an old friend, someone she trusted implicitly, a former federal investigator turned private consultant. "Late call from you," the familiar voice said on the other end. "I need a favor," she replied, her tone measured but firm. "I've received something troubling, and I need it looked into discreetly." "You've got it. Send it my way, and I'll get to work." She hung up, feeling a small measure of relief. She wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but she also knew the value of trusted allies in battles like this. The following days were a whirlwind of post-trial procedures and media inquiries. The public reaction to the case was overwhelmingly positive, with many praising her for her steadfast commitment to justice. But beneath the surface, the undercurrent of the note's warning remained. Her investigator friend called a few days later with preliminary findings. "It's strange. Whoever sent this didn't leave much of a trail, but the phrasing and tone suggest someone with intimate knowledge of the trial. My guess, it's someone connected to the case, but not directly involved, someone who wants to keep the waters murky." She absorbed the information, her mind working through the possibilities. The trial had attracted a wide range of players, from corporate executives to whistleblowers to legal strategists. The list of people who might want to challenge her was long, but the motive behind the note remained elusive. Weeks passed, and life began to settle back into its usual rhythm. The case had set a significant precedent, and she found herself speaking at conferences and panels about its impact on corporate accountability. Each time, she emphasized the importance of courage, integrity, and the relentless pursuit of truth. But one evening, as she prepared for an event, she found another envelope waiting for her on her desk. This one bore no message, only a photograph, a blurry image of herself entering the courthouse on the morning of the trial. Her pulse quickened, the implications of the photo clear. Someone had been watching her, their intentions still unclear. But this time, she felt a spark of defiance rise within her. Whoever was behind this wanted to instill fear, to make her doubt her path. Instead, she found herself more resolute than ever. She took the photo and the note to her investigator friend, who promised to continue digging. But she also made a decision. She wouldn't let the specter of threats dictate her actions. She had faced countless challenges in her career, and each one had only strengthened her resolve. As the months went on, the mystery of the notes faded into the background, an unsolved puzzle that no longer consumed her thoughts. The case's legacy lived on, inspiring new legislation and sparking debates about corporate ethics. The whistleblower went on to become an advocate for systemic change, their bravery setting an example for others to follow. And she continued her work on the bench, her reputation as a fair and fearless judge growing with each case she presided over. She knew the road ahead would be filled with new challenges, but she welcomed them. Because justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and she was ready for whatever came next. As she sat in her chambers one quiet afternoon, reviewing documents for her next case, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The trial, the twists, the threats, they were all reminders of the complexity of the world she operated in. But they were also reminders of the power of persistence, the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. The notes, the photograph, the whispers of uncertainty, they hadn't broken her. If anything, they had reminded her of why she chose this path in the first place. As she signed off on the final page of the document before her, she glanced out the window at the bustling city below. The world was far from perfect, but she believed in its potential for change, and as long as she had a role to play in shaping that change, she would continue to rise to the challenge. Because in the end, it wasn't about the threats or the trials or the moments of doubt. It was about the quiet, steady pursuit of truth, a pursuit that would always, always endure.